El día de hoy tenemos al Dr. Richard Davidson, presidente del Centro para las Mentes Sanas de la Universidad de Wisconsin, y a la doctora Peggy Rockefeller. Ella es líder de Sinergos, una organización filantrópica a nivel mundial. Estará moderando el panel el maestro Agustín Barrios Gómez, consejero de Comexi, y le pido a Daniela Labra, socia fundadora y directora general de Atentamente, que nos dé unas palabras de bienvenida. Gracias a todos.
Pues buenas noches a todos. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Yo soy Daniela Labra, como dijo Katy, yo soy directora general de Atentamente Consultores y es un honor para nosotros estar aquí esta noche con todos ustedes y con nuestros panelistas. Welcome, thank you for being here. Y estamos también muy agradecidos, por supuesto, como dijo Catalina, con el Club de Industriales, con Comexi, con Sinergos, pero sobre todo con ustedes, porque están aquí, porque nos hayamos reunido entre la lluvia, el corte de agua y nuestros muertos, ¿verdad? En este como muy sincrético Halloween, ¿no? ¿Pero para qué? Para pensar en un nuevo liderazgo, en cómo educar y aprender habilidades para el bienestar personal y social. Y bueno, miren, si todo falla, no se olviden de sus botellitas de agua, se pueden llevar alguna para la contingencia. Estamos muy felices realmente de ver rostros amigos y también amigos por conocer y de tanta gente que está tan comprometida con México. Hoy tenemos muchísimos retos, como ser el país número 1 en estrés laboral, como que el 70% de los niños reportan haber sido acosados por sus pares, ¿no? Buleados verbalmente, y donde nos ocupa realmente que nuestros niños y jóvenes puedan recibir una educación de calidad, equitativa, incluyente y completa, que los prepare para el futuro. Yo creo que también los adultos queremos experimentar mucha mayor armonía social y un país que florezca, pero no solo económicamente, socialmente. El panorama es retador, pero hay mucho potencial. Así que hablar de bienestar no es un lujo, es una necesidad. La búsqueda más inmediata de cada uno de nosotros en todo lo que hacemos, en casa, en el trabajo, en lo privado, en lo público, en las políticas que hacemos o dejamos de hacer, es por estar bien. ¿Pero qué quiere decir estar bien? A nivel personal, a nivel social. ¿Qué queremos experimentar? Hoy vamos a escuchar que el bienestar es una habilidad. Pues qué competencias y conocimientos tenemos que desarrollar como sociedad para fortalecer esa habilidad del bienestar. Que sea no solo un punto de referencia que marque el camino, sino una brújula que nos guíe. Porque no hay progreso que valga la pena si ese progreso no tiene en el centro a las personas. Porque el mundo tiene más información que nunca, pero eso no nos hace estar más informados. Y más vías de comunicación que nunca, pero no nos hace estar más comunicados. El gran reto de nuestro tiempo es humano. Cómo aprender a ser y convivir. Y no simplemente a sobrevivir, sino a florecer. Y sí se puede. El bienestar no es un don, sino una habilidad que como todas se puede desarrollar y para todos. Así que les agradecemos tomarse el tiempo para pensar juntos, para oír voces de la neurociencia, de la filantropía, del ámbito organizacional, para participar ciudadanamente, para reunir el talento y trabajo de los mexicanos en todos los ámbitos, público y privado, para que podamos avanzar sobre todos los pasos que ya están dados y corregir y mejorar para educarnos todos y para seguir construyendo un país y un mundo para todos entre todos. Así que muchísimas gracias por estar aquí y los dejo aquí con los ponentes. Muy bienvenidos. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Daniela. Efectivamente, muy buenas tardes, soy Agustín Barrios Gómez, soy miembro del Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales, Comexi, coanfitriones con esta gran AC gran asociación civil que es Atentamente y evidentemente con las organizaciones aquí representadas. Yo moderaré este panel el día de hoy, dándole la bienvenida a Peggy Delaney Rockefeller y al neurocientífico Dr. Richie Davidson. El panel se va a llevar a cabo en inglés, entonces les pido nada más a todas las personas que necesiten algún equipo de traducción simultánea, que tengo entendido que los tenemos, por favor los utilicen. Just to begin, Peggy, Richie, thank you for being here. Welcome to this primordial megalopolis that is Great Mexico City, not only the biggest city in the Western Hemisphere, but in many ways the capital of the political and cultural capital of what was North America, at least from the very beginning. It's a very important city for our region, and I think it's very fitting that we're talking about these issues in this 21st century here. So today, the country and our region face many, many important challenges, including, of course, violence, inequality, corruption on our side of the border, growing racism on the other side of the border. And all of this, I suspect, has much to do with how emotionally limited we still are as human beings. And I think that that's why it's so important that we're here today. So in Mexico, thanks to the good offices of many people, many of those actually here represented in civil society, at the UNDP, at our Ministry of Education, we've taken a step towards giving people those tools for socio-emotional learning, what's known in the trade as SEL. Mexico, as far as I understand, has implemented the largest program of its type in the world, something that I think all of us as Mexicans can be very, very proud of. And you've got that on one hand, and then, of course, on the other hand, the OECD just came out with a study saying that socio-emotional learning, or SEL, is the most important kind of learning there is. So there's all this hype. Richie, and I'd like to start with you. Why all the hoopla? How do we know that this works, and what are we looking for when we talk about SEL?
Well, thank you for all of you for being here and for listening to this important dialogue. Socio-emotional learning, or social emotional learning, is fundamental for several different reasons. I'll share a few scientific facts. There are findings which show that a child's social and emotional capacities when she or he is 4 and 5 years of age are the single best predictor of major adult life outcomes when the individual is in their early 30s, after taking into account the socioeconomic status of the families, medical issues, intelligence. It turns out that these social emotional qualities, particularly a child's capacity for self-regulation, is an extraordinarily important predictor of outcomes like the propensity to abuse drugs at age 32, physical health, the likelihood of being adjudicated within the court system for criminal behavior. And finally, data show that individuals who have a greater socio-emotional capacity at this age actually end up as young adults to earn more money after very carefully controlling for these other factors, including the socioeconomic status of the family. And so these qualities really matter. And one of the qualities which is so important for social emotional learning is attention. And attention is the building block for all other forms of learning. If a child is impaired in her or his ability to actually pay attention to information that's being presented, it will severely compromise all other forms of learning. In a recent study published in a very prestigious scientific journal in the United States, it was found that the average American adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. 47% of the time. Can you envision a world where that changed even by 5%, with a teacher being able to show up for a student and being fully present, a doctor in a relationship with a patient, a hotel employee interacting with a customer, being able to simply be present. One of the things that we've learned in modern science is that these qualities can actually be educated. And this is why I think this conversation is so important.
And coming back to that, just to make sure that we understand what we're talking about, what are some of these tools, and what does success look like?
Well, success looks like, we can measure success in two different ways. We can measure what we think of as the proximal indicators of success. So scientists have strategies to measure qualities like attention. We can measure them very rigorously, but they will also predict what we think of as more distal outcomes.
I'm sorry, define distal?
Distal is further out in the future. So being able to be a better student, earning better grades, is a distal outcome that should be affected by these qualities. And it turns out there's a meta-analysis, which is an analysis of many studies that was published a few years ago with a sample size that was greater than 280,000 children. And what it found is that social emotional learning, social emotional education actually produced increases of 11% on standardized test scores. That is a distal outcome that really matters. And so more and more evidence is suggesting that these qualities actually are fundamentally more important, particularly early in life, but really throughout life, than traditional academic measures of success.
Peggy, and speaking of how that impacts society as a whole, SEL is also known as pro-social skills, right? So you deal in leadership, and through Synergos you deal in philanthropy. What can SEL offer the world in a world in which those skills, the leadership skills and philanthropy and what that means, actually philos, right, actually caring for your other being, in a world where misanthropy seems to be the rule, what can SEL offer?
So I've been dealing more with adults than children, but there's no question that how children grow up and what they become is very much dependent on whether they get SEL or not. Once we get to be adults, here's the issue. All of us face traumas or difficulties at some point in our life. And I always love listening to Richie because I learn different ways of expressing it each time. So his articulating it as the ability to be present, to focus, to pay attention, is another way of saying what I've been talking about, which is that those traumas or difficulties we've faced create within ourselves obstacles. Obstacles, now I can say, to being present. But what does that mean? It means that if we are going to be leaders, if we're going to be our best person out there in the world, doing our best to do our work, be good family members, help improve the world, we need to overcome those things that distract us from being present. And the kinds of workshops and events that we've been doing over a period of about 15 years turn out to enable people to, first of all, recognize what those obstacles are. Often they express themselves as fear, which I view as the opposite of love, or shame, in which one feels one doesn't even deserve to exist. And those things make us want to hide. What we need in the world now, and this is the embodiment, in my view, of SEL, is people who are willing, they have the self-confidence, they are trustworthy so that other people trust that they're being authentic and real, and they can go out in the world and reach out across divides. In divided societies like the US and Mexico, there is too much of that pulling in and not reaching out in a generous and open-hearted way. Once people can do that, and if we'd all had more SEL as children, we would be better at doing it, but I'm dealing with people who often haven't had that and therefore need to begin to recuperate as adults. Once we have that, we can speak from the heart, people trust us. We have our own constituency that we can bring along into what I would call collaborative problem solving, so that then other people from another constituency bring their people in, and then you begin to have the basis for building trust across these divides that exist, whether it's to work on problems of economic issues or health issues or whatever it is that we're trying to overcome. So that's how I would make the equation between the initial need for SEL to become fully realized human beings, or if we haven't had that so much as children, what we can begin to do to overcome that.
And that's part of the answer. But I was asked to ask this particular question: what happens when you don't have an emphasis on pro-social skills, on socio-emotional learning? I mean, even at the height, the very pinnacle of today's society in a Silicon Valley, for example, you're getting examples of people who have serious deficiencies in some areas in their emotional intelligence, to put it in the way of your co-author, Dan Goleman. When you don't pay attention to these things, it would seem that we start running into those issues that Peggy was talking about.
One of the things Peggy mentioned is fear. What we know is that fear contracts awareness. It literally contracts awareness. It puts blinders on people so that they focus more exclusively on their in-group. They withdraw in the way that Peggy was describing, and they literally pay less attention. They become unaware of many factors around them. And so the ability to relate in a healthier way to fear, and we get so much of that from the media, is an important constituent of social and emotional learning. And in the absence of that, we get hijacked. And so rather than being the rudder, the driver, the steerer of our own mind, we allow our minds to be swept away like a sailboat in the middle of a turbulent ocean that has lost its rudder. That is what happens to the mind when it is not trained in this way. And that leads to a lot of problems. But the good news is that the very mechanisms in our mind and our brain that allow us to be hijacked, these are mechanisms of neuroplasticity, are the same mechanisms that we can use to wake up and to transform in ways that are healthier.
And how do we validate that? Just to understand a little bit about the process, because I think a lot of us hear about these things and it sounds fantastic. There's certainly a lot of literature behind it. A lot of very intelligent people are talking about it. But when you get down to it, what are we talking about? What are those tools that we are giving people to help them with this?
Well, and this is an opportunity to just say a little bit about Attentamente. I'm here really because of my deep respect for what it is that Attentamente is doing here in Mexico. And it's not just the largest program in the world, but there's something more important than that, and that is it's the best program in the world. Simply being the largest, that's one thing, but if it's not high quality, it's really much less significant. It is really the best. I've been around a lot. I've seen many of these programs in different parts of the world, but this is a program that's informed by modern science as well as by older traditions from which insights can be gleaned about how we can train the mind in ways that are healthy. And there are simple exercises that we can do. We can think of these as mental exercises. It's the equivalent of physical exercise for the mind. And if we go back 50 years, the role of physical exercise in our weekly routine was very different. Over the last 50 years, in part because of scientific evidence, many people now recognize the value of physical exercise. And what we're talking about here are simple mental exercises that can be done to strengthen qualities like self-regulation, responsible decision-making, self-awareness, social awareness, being able to attend to the social cues of others, responsible decision-making, These are all teachable skills, and this is part of the constellation of skills that really constitute well-being. And it's led scientists like myself to a very simple, but we think a very radical conclusion, and that is that well-being is best regarded as a skill. And we can learn well-being.
Like spinning or yoga?
Like both of them. Yeah.
Peggy, what has been your experience? I mean, yeah, I think Richie brought up a very important point, which is the fact that we've acknowledged, we've internalized many learnings over the past 50 years vis-a-vis how, how stuff works and how we can become healthier human beings. Are you seeing that play itself out? And what role is all of this playing?
So when you say mental exercises, I start to refer that to the experiences that I've both seen and also know about. And it makes me think of social exercises as well, because a lot of this is interactive. So let me give an example, which I think I've been telling Catalina that she needs to get to know this group in South Africa. It's a group that's a foundation that chose a state in South Africa that was willing to really invest in creating higher standards of education. But the interesting thing is, how did they do it? It wasn't academics at all. And in fact, the person who was the funder and the creator of this had been to a retreat that we led and found that it had a very important personal impact on him through the interaction he'd had with the group. So what he did is, in these communities, and this was all over one state, he took the teachers on a retreat. And as we all know, teachers are undervalued, underpaid. They really need encouragement. They need social and emotional learning, which is part of what Atentamente is doing. So when they found out that they had this result of going from last to first in academic achievement, and this is public school education in South Africa, they then began reviewing what were the key factors. Guess what? It was the retreat that the teachers took. They had some space for themselves. They could begin to build trust among themselves as a group. The principal came and went and had some interaction. The teachers felt more respected by the principal. They began to feel safe, because a big piece of this is creating safe spaces within which people can dare to be their authentic self, dare to be vulnerable, dare to ask for help from each other. This was the key factor that led this one state from going from last to first. Had nothing to do with the students even, but just changing the way the teachers felt about themselves and interacted with themselves, the principal, the parents, and the students enabled this shift.
That's a fascinating anecdote, and I think that can be extrapolated. Like you mentioned, Atentamente has been working very closely with the teachers as the starting point. You don't actually necessarily want to go directly to those 5 million children that eventually will be impacted, but go through the teachers. And there's a point that I want to get back to, Richie, which is this concept of well-being. Our incoming administration is certainly highlighting the need for well-being. In fact, the Ministry of Labor, what is the Secretaría de Trabajo, is now going to be called the Ministry of Labor and Well-being, la Secretaría de Trabajo y Bienestar. So if you could tell us a little bit about, you're one of the principal investigators of this issue on a worldwide level. What should we be looking for to know how to implement a program that actually really does help in terms of well-being?
Well, in our work, we have framed well-being as comprising 4 key constituents. Each of these constituents has been investigated scientifically. We know something about the brain mechanisms that underlie each of these, and I'll just mention them very, very briefly. The first we call awareness. And awareness includes basic capacity for attention that we mentioned earlier. The second constituent we call connection, and this is really relevant to a lot of what Peggy just described. This is about what the key elements are of successful interpersonal and social relationships. Qualities like trust, empathy, care, kindness. These are all part of connection. The third we call insight, and it's really insight into this narrative that we all have about ourselves. We all have these thoughts about who we are, and at a very extreme end, we have people who have very self-defeating thoughts, and they actually believe them. And this is symptomatic of people who suffer from depression. And so part of well-being is understanding what a healthy relationship to this narrative actually is. And finally, the fourth element is purpose. Having a clear direction, a kind of true north toward which our life is going, and especially aligning our everyday behavior with that sense of purpose. And each of these elements is critical, we think, and each can be trained, each can be educated. Now, one of the really interesting things about well-being that I want to mention in this little discussion here is that well-being is not simply a subjective psychological quality, but well-being matters for many other things. It matters for our social relationships, and it also matters for our physical health.
How do you measure it?
Well, so let me give you one example of this. This comes from a study that was published in the scientific literature that was done at a healthcare organization, one of the largest healthcare organizations in the US, called Aetna, very well-known, large organization. They had a well-being program for their employees that included many of the elements that Attentamente uses with their teachers, although it wasn't taught as well as Attentamente.
They're not one of our sponsors, as you can tell.
So they did this program, and one of the things they tracked, since they were a healthcare organization, is they tracked their physical health, and they particularly tracked healthcare costs. And what they found is that there was an average reduction of $113 per month per employee 1 year after this program. $113 per month per employee. And so this, we think, really matters. And there's a lot of epidemiological research that indicates that well-being and physical health are positively correlated. So if we can promote well-being, we can make a difference in terms of physical health and healthcare costs.
So coming back to the narrative, which was Peggy, which is something that Richie was just mentioning. For the moment, what we attend to is reality, right? That was said by the father of psychology, that William James. Thank you very much, William James. And so what we attend to is reality, the narrative that we create. I mention this because I know that your organization deals a lot with the issue of narrative. The stories that we tell each other are actually become our reality, correct? So how can we change the narrative? How can we go from being societies that right now seem to be highlighting misanthropy to highlighting philanthropy?
So I think a start is to begin to relate to each other in a different way. And I'll just talk about the US because I live there. The polarization that's existing right now in the US is so destructive. And a lot of people, fortunately, are beginning to realize this and beginning to realize that the polarization comes from many factors, including fear, by the way, and is being fomented, unfortunately, by different groups. So the kind of dialogue interventions that a number of groups are trying to foment is the beginning of breaking down what the narrative is about the other person. If you can get them to relate to each other, human being to human being, very often you find that the differences in ideology, for example, are not even important if you can get them to talk about the human factors that bring them together. So that would be one thing. But another thing I wanted to take up from what Richie just said about the 4 elements of well-being. The insight, which is the overcoming the narrative or understanding, maybe standing aside from the narrative so that you can notice when you go into that narrative and actually stop yourself from doing it, is one of the precursors in our experience to understanding what our deepest purpose in life is. Because too often what happens, this is my belief, you don't have to believe it, but I believe that we're each born with our soul's purpose for this life on this earth. But the exigencies of life tend to cover that over. We need to take this job because it earns more money even though it's not what we want to do, or any example like that. Once we begin to wipe away those layers of this is what I have to do and sink into, okay, but who am I really? What is my purpose in life? Then what comes up automatically is philos, the desire to reach out and help others. And ironically, the desire to reach out to help others, when we start to do it, makes us feel better about ourselves. If we're bound up in fear, misery, shame, etc., whatever, depression, then it's very hard to reach out and be our biggest selves. I talk about our small selves, the contracted self. But if we can get over some of the narrative, we'll never completely get over it, by the way. Those narratives will live with us, but if we can notice them and say, oh, there's my narrative speaking again, and instead have the courage to reach out and talk to someone who is maybe of a different perspective, a different social stratum, a different sector of society, with respect and with curiosity instead of judgment. All of those things, and then having the space, and I mean the emotional as well as physical space, to drop down a little bit below the daily chatter of our monkey minds, we call it, through meditation, yoga, whatever. There are a number of practices we can do in our own home or we can do in a group outside. Then we can begin to access what our original purpose was. And even if the exigencies of our life don't allow us to just drop our current life and go and do what it is that we meant, the purpose almost always has something of service in it. And once we can access that desire to be of service, I call it serving with love, that begins to change the whole equation inside ourselves, with the group with which we interact, and eventually in the society.
And beautifully put, Peggy, thank you. I think, Richie, in terms of where the rubber hits the road, in specific societal issues, like violence in our society, like racism in the United States right now, how does that all tie in from a scientific viewpoint?
Well, it ties in several different ways. One of the core elements that we see in programs that promote well-being is a reduction in this notion of implicit bias. Implicit bias. And what
is that?
Implicit bias is a kind of unconscious bias toward outgroups, which is very much at the root of the polarization that Peggy was referring to in the US today. And there's a lot of evidence, even if a person says on a questionnaire that they're not biased at all toward an outgroup, I guarantee you that if I brought them to our lab, we would be able to show that they're biased. Because these are more subtle measures.
Your lab or the voting booth, right?
Yes. That are under the skin and actually affect the brain in really extraordinary ways. We know that in the US today, more than 90% of Caucasian people, white people who are shown a face of an African American will show greater activation in fear circuits in the brain. And actually, when African Americans are tested in the same way, they show the same kind, 75% of them show the same pattern of activation and show more fear to their own race, which suggests that this bias is so pervasive in the US today. But again, the good news is that these same mechanisms that allowed the bias to creep in the first place can be opportunities for transformation. And so there is A few other things to say, particularly about the comments that Peggy made. Another amazing area of research that is getting more and more attention indicates that every human being seems to come into the world with what we call innate basic goodness. Innate basic goodness. They actually they prefer to be pro-social. And you can see this in very young infants. Before, as Peggy put it, before the exigencies of life take over. And so this is really who we are at our core. But we think of these qualities very much the way scientists think of language. We all come into the world with a biological propensity for language. But in order for that propensity to flourish, it needs to be nurtured. And we know that there are case studies of feral children raised in the wild who do not develop normal language. And
so feral children, just so people understand, raised in the wild, that is, that have no contact with what we consider civilization.
Yes, thank you. So, these kinds of data suggest that we really do have this preference for pro-social behavior, for generosity, and the single most powerful way to activate circuits in the brain that are important for well-being is through generosity. And there are experimental data, hard-nosed scientific data to show this. And we know from other kinds of research that when people are given the opportunity to spend money that they're actually given and buy gifts for other people, they are much more happy than if they're given the same amount of money and told to just spend money for themselves, to buy gifts for themselves. So there's just a growing body of scientific evidence to support this. And the kind of programs that Attentamente is implementing are programs that we can think of at their root are designed to nurture these basic capacities. They're not creating anything from nothing, but rather they're nurturing qualities that we already have.
Peggy, in order to pick up on what Richie was saying, we've mentioned certainly Attentamente, but this is a very large undertaking that not just includes the nonprofit that is Attentamente, but it also includes the UN Development Program. It also obviously includes our Ministry of Education. I would also be remiss in the case of Mexico, how the Ibero-American University, La Universidad Iberoamericana, has also been instrumental in helping out. This is it takes a village. Well, in this case, it takes a megacity, or it takes a country of 127 million people. One of the things that I get whenever I leave conferences where I participate, people ask, what can I do, right? So we know what they're doing. But what can we do at the individual level, and how do you work with that in your organization?
I like to think of the social tapestry as writ large as what our society looks like. And if you break it down into each thread, crossing each thread, the way a social tapestry holds together is if there are forces, meaning people, at each of those intersections who are strengthening the social bond, the social capital. You need it in communities, you need it in families, you need it in cities, you need it in the government, you need it in the business sector, in civil society, and religious organizations. However, in today's complex society, what you need even more than those individual intersections is those larger ones across those different sectors. And I think in Mexico, as in the US, there's a lot of trust that's been broken or that's been never developed across those sectors. So one of the things that I think is really important is that we, in whatever capacity we come here in, whether we're a business person, a government person, media, civil society, etc., that we begin to think, okay, who is in my ambit, who's in a different position than I am, who I could begin talking to, begin trying to understand their perspective. And there are organizations, of course, that do this. And around issues of education, it's the perfect one for people to come together. There must be no one in Mexico that doesn't understand that how our children develop is like the most important thing for the future of the country. So if there's any single subject around which people ought to be able to come together. We need to begin to develop those circles in each town, each village, each city, each state, so that this can really come to fruition. And I wanted to come back to teachers for a minute, because teachers are so fundamental to this. I mean, of course you can't do it with the students if the teachers don't know how to work with them, and if the teachers don't feel good about themselves. So working with the Secretariat of Education around this thing of empowering teachers, allowing them to have some social and emotional learning, and then figuring out the ways that they can then bring that into the schools is extremely important. But it's such a huge task. You need organizations that are working with parents, because if the parents don't have it, it's going to be harder for the children. They may have it in school and then not at home. You need community organizations, because the community needs to be brought together. You need businesses who understand this and are willing to really invest in the future of Mexico's children. And most importantly, government from top to bottom to really be behind this, to be sure that this is going to be a priority for all Mexicans on behalf of the children, but involving all of us.
With respect to that, Richie, is there hope in terms of remedial training? I mean, we talk about the children. You know, I believe the children are our future. But at the end of the day, these societies have issues today, and these issues could very well kill us all. So, is there an intervention to be done?
I think there is an intervention to be done, and I think that we have a moral obligation as modern societies to engage with these issues in a very serious way, because the very future of our civilization and our planet as we know it will depend on exactly these issues. I see, despite all of the difficulties in this country, in the United States, and in many parts of the world, I see lots of hopeful signs. I think that we are recognizing the challenge of the course that we are currently on. And I think that one of the most important elements here is being able to envision what a future will look like that is different if people actually took their minds seriously. One of the things I often say is that every person sitting in this audience brushes their teeth a few times a day. Humans didn't come onto the planet learning to brush their teeth. It's something that we've learned as a form of personal physical hygiene. We can learn to treat our minds with the same respect that we treat our teeth. And pardon me if there are any dentists in the audience, but I do think that our minds are probably even more important than our teeth. And so it's
Are you a neural dentist? Is that the idea?
So I think it's kind of a really part of caring for this precious resource that we have, and I think it's possible. When Martin Luther King gave his famous speech in the United States, when the situation was quite bleak and racism was rampant, as it still is today, the title of his speech was not "I Have a Nightmare." And I think that it's very important not to allow the problems in our societies today to bring us down, to see that there is an alternative mode of being that is absolutely possible, that each of us can adopt. And having that vision is part of what will allow us to, I think, transform in these ways.
And can I just comment on that? I always put myself at risk.
Do you have a dream, Peggy?
Yes. But I always put myself at risk when I try to say something scientific in front of a neuroscientist. So let's see how this goes over. It is my understanding that we actually have more neurons in our heart and our gut than we do in our brain. So I believe, and in a minute he'll tell you whether this is true or false. But let's just stick with me for a minute.
Put yourself out there.
Yeah. But whether or not that's technically true, let me just say this, that when Richie talks about the mind, I believe that you're also talking about the heart and the spirit and the gut, and that it is the integration of those that makes us whole and that actually represents social and emotional health.
Yeah, totally. Wonderful.
You want to answer that one, or are we good?
Well, the technical details are not important. What's important is Peggy's heart, which is really beautiful, and the notion that it is the heart and the gut is critical, and also is why well-being is connected to physical health. I mean, this stuff is really embodied. And we're not just transforming our subjective impressions, but we're actually transforming our souls in a very deep way that includes our bodies.
I came across the definition of wisdom, the dictionary definition of wisdom, very recently, and I'm not sure which dictionary, but it took into account those three things. It was knowledge, the head, right? Understanding, the heart, and intuition, the gut. So I think independent of the amount of neurons, there is certainly something there, and something that we've known for as long as, basically, at least since the cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago, right? So with that, I think we can open the floor for a few questions. We've got about half an hour, and I think that would be a good way to continue the conversation, or otherwise I can open it. We can certainly keep talking up here. Does anybody have any question? And do we have a microphone? ¿Hay alguna pregunta? Y si tenemos algún micrófono que lo pudieran llevar a quien tenga dicha pregunta. Nombre y pregunta, por favor.
Good night. My name is Rogelio Garcia, and my question is, last week, the Mexican labor minister approved a rule that obligates to the companies to reduce social psycho factors in the enterprise, because Mexico's workers suffer stress 43 to 45% about it. So how these socio-emotional skills can help to the managers, to the leaders, to reduce the stress on the company.
Que de hecho está relacionado con el hecho de que estamos en el número 1 en estrés laboral, ¿verdad?
Exactly.
Okay, todo el mundo entendió. So you got that, right?
And the second question is, how can we registered a technology in the same minister to reduce stress. It was proven. So how can we work together to try to expand this technology and of course do the test that you define to demonstrate that it works in stress reduction? That's my question.
Go ahead, Richie.
The role of workplace stress is very important. Our center has been working with many large corporations, some of the largest corporations in the world, who recognize this as a major problem. And so it's not just in Mexico, but it's really a global issue. And we come back to the importance here of cultivating well-being as an important element in the workplace. And if this was a commonly adopted practice that workplace settings incorporated into their daily and weekly routines, I think a lot can change as a consequence. We see that there are biological measures of stress that we can obtain. For example, from a saliva sample, we can measure hormones that reflect stress. And we have evidence, we being the scientific community, have evidence that simple programs like the programs that Atentamente is implementing can actually reduce these levels of hormones, the stress hormones, so that they're, again, it's not just a change in our subjective experience, but it actually influences our bodies in ways that we know will impact physical health. So I think that this is so important for workplace settings. And when organizations, when businesses understand that this can lead to less absenteeism, improved health, greater productivity because workers will be more attentive, then it will be a tipping point where every corporation in Mexico and for that matter on the planet will want to incorporate this into their everyday routine.
Thank you, Richie. Who else has the microphone? ¿Quién tiene el micrófono? Adelante.
Thank you. Good night.
Ay, sí, si quieren, por cierto, si quieren hacer su pregunta en español, yo con mucho gusto puedo traducir en tiempo real, no hay problema.
I will try. I'm Mauricio. I'm a teacher. We have a group of study group, and we work in the Happy Planet Index. And I would love to know your opinion. Is it trustful? Is it fraud? Is it for real? I really want to know your opinion, please.
Do you know of it?
I do know of it, and there are other indices that are similar to it. The UN issues a report each year, the World Happiness Report. These are measures that we think of as crude. They're not nuanced measures. They are simple, but they don't have great scientific validity. So I think that they're a start, but we need to develop much better tools. And one of the important challenges for future scientific research in this area is to develop much better measures of these qualities.
Next question. ¿Quién tiene el micrófono? Muy bien.
Hola, gracias. Voy a hablar en español. Yo soy Marta Díaz, soy directora del Instituto Mindfulness de México. Y bueno, pues sí, creo en la meditación, creo que tenemos muchas técnicas prácticas para el liderazgo y para la educación socioemocional, no solamente para jóvenes, para las universidades, también para las empresas. Y mi pregunta es esto, lamentablemente cuando estamos en las empresas, yo como directora del instituto, que he sido también diplomática y he sido ejecutiva internacional, puedo entender el estrés que viven los líderes. Sin embargo, hay una resistencia muy grande en que los líderes, tanto hombres como mujeres, reconozcan que están cayendo en un estado de estrés o que están cayendo en un estado social, socioemocional muy fuerte. No quieren reconocerlo. Y cuando yo me ofrezco a darles a ellos el curso de mindfulness basado en la reducción del estrés, dicen que ellos no lo necesitan, que solamente sus colaboradores, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué puedo hacer para convencer que, bueno, el liderazgo se tiene que manifestar muy claramente, muy genuinamente a través de todas estas pruebas, ¿no? De estas técnicas? ¿Cómo le puedo hacer?
Afortunadamente Peggy entendió perfectamente eso en español de tal manera que no tengo que traducir.
So, of course, the individual leader has to get to a point where they recognize that not only their employees, but they also need something of this sort. I have a couple of suggestions. One is that peers influence peers. So to the extent that there are some leaders, and you're talking mostly about businesses, but this would be the same anywhere in government and civil society, etc. There's some leaders who have experienced a shift because of this and are willing to make themselves vulnerable enough to admit it. They will have the most influence on their peers. And I think increasingly this is actually happening. I think a lot of companies are realizing that the well-being of their company depends on the well-being of their employees, but also on the well-being of them as leaders. So that's not something that you can probably interfere with because you're offering the service. But the other thing is that, as you know, there are many kinds of interventions. There are some people who are maybe not advertising it as mindfulness, but maybe as effectiveness. So for people who are very much in their minds it probably would be a more effective strategy to use some of the statistics that Richie and Dan Goleman have about the better performance of companies and employees, et cetera, and start there rather than from the mindfulness or the heartfulness or whatever.
Richie, if I may, I'd like you to jump in there because you just wrote a book with Dan Goleman, you know, the seminal author of Emotional Intelligence, and there are many words for this. One of them being mindfulness, which is effectiveness. I mean, how could you be effective if you're not mindful of what you're doing? It's pretty basic. But if you could go in just a little bit further on that, on what we're talking about.
Well, I think that, first of all, it's important to recognize that one size does not fit all. And so there are many different interventions, many different strategies, as Peggy was alluding to promote these qualities. And I think it's important that we not privilege any one particularly, because we know from scientific evidence that there are different strategies that may be more effective for different kinds of people. But I also really endorse Peggy's comments about the importance of peers speaking out in these contexts. We know that one of the most powerful forms of learning is what we can think of as social learning. It's learning through the embodiment of these qualities from others, being able to actually see in another person the qualities that we're talking about cultivating, rather than talking about the qualities, experiencing them. And that is a very powerful mode of communicating the importance and the power of these kinds of practices.
Being an example.
Well, one of the examples, I have the great fortune of having spent quite a bit of time over the last 25 years with the Dalai Lama, someone who very much exemplifies qualities like compassion. And when you're with him, you feel it. You really feel it. It's not something that he needs to talk about, although he does talk about it, but simply being in his presence and experiencing the qualities that are being emanated is very, very powerful. He gave a talk at the National Institutes of Health a couple of years ago that I helped arrange, and one of the places that he visited on the campus of the NIH, which is the largest biomedical research facility in the world. And there's a hospital on the campus where people who are very, very sick are being treated with experimental treatments. And the Dalai Lama walked down this hallway and simply met the patients. And I would say 50% of the patients had no idea who he was. And it didn't matter. He went up to each of them and touched them and simply asked them about how they're doing, and it was compassion in action. These are the qualities which are infectious. And when you experience that, you see very clearly what human beings are actually capable of. And these are inspiring examples.
Very, very inspiring. And ¿quién tiene el micrófono para la próxima pregunta? ¿Por allá?
Sí. Hello, my name is Marlene Grass. I'd like to ask, could you please elaborate on how social emotional learning can be incorporated into work environments and work training? Like, could you mention some successful interventions?
Do you want to pick that one up, or Peggy?
Well, the example you mentioned earlier of Aetna, the huge insurance company, is a really good one, where, first of all, they made available kitchen that everybody could go to and choose healthy foods, because obviously they want people to be... Yeah, kitchen, okay. Yes, with food. So the employees were allowed to avail themselves of that. They set up meditation rooms. They allowed employees the space to take half an hour in the middle of the day and take a nap or meditate or whatever they need. They put gymnasiums in the workplace so that people could exercise. They set up daycare centers inside the company. All of these are ways of, first of all, showing the employees that they matter, and secondly, providing the kinds of services that are going to reduce stress. Exercise reduces stress. Eating healthy reduces stress. Meditating. Knowing that your children are nearby and are being taken care of. All of that was a real factor, and I'm sure there were many other things that I didn't hear about, but in improving the morale and the effectiveness of the employees. But those are all potential little elements of social and emotional learning. Caring is a part of social and emotional learning, and this was demonstrating from the very top that there was caring.
And just to mention one other program, one of the largest and most successful programs of this kind in a workplace setting has been happening at Google, and the program is called Search Inside Yourself. And more than 10,000 Google employees have now gone through this program. And it includes many of the elements that we're talking about. Simple practices of awareness, practices related to connection, and it's done in groups where the employees come together and also have an opportunity to share in the kind of vulnerable way that Peggy was describing earlier, which is an important element of this kind of training. And it really required only a modest commitment from the employees. It was not more than a couple of hours a week that they participated in this, and Google provided an opportunity, spaces for them to do this, and they could do this on so-called paid time, because they recognize that having employees who actually are happier at work, more fulfilled, content, paying more attention, will be better for the organization.
It all sounds very expensive, is it? Or is it expensive not to do?
I would say not to do it is far more costly than doing it. And fundamentally, what we need, the most important element in this is our own mind, which each of us is endowed with, and which we don't have to pay for. And so...
You'd be surprised.
So I think that, we go back to the healthcare cost issue. I think it's penny wise and pound foolish not to do this. And we know that there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that the benefits in pure economic terms are very, very significant. And I wanted to mention one other thing in relation to this, which is poverty. I know that eliminating poverty is an important position in the new Mexican government. And while I certainly only know just a little bit about what I've been told, this is certainly an inspiring aspiration. There are hard-nosed scientific data that show that if you take families in extreme poverty and you randomize them to a group that gets direct cash transfer and another group that gets training in basic social and emotional skills, and you look several years down the road at the economic consequences, what you see is that prosperity improves significantly more in pure economic terms for those individuals who are randomly assigned to receive the social and emotional training. Significantly more than direct cash transfer. So it makes economic sense to do this, and it is going to be ultimately much more costly, particularly if you take into account the cost of dealing with violence, with drug abuse, with antisocial behavior, with all of those kinds of problems down the road.
Excellent. Next question. ¿Quién tiene el micrófono?
Hi, my name is Eduardo Macé. About a year and a half ago, I was at the World Happiness Summit, sharing a panel that's just like yours, with Sean Acor, it was John Emanuel, it was Talvin Shahar. Hola. Okay. Oh, sorry. And at this panel, they try to show this happy index. And they were talking about how happy or how well ranked countries like the States and Mexico are within the top 25. And when I had my chance to take the mic, I argued that because you're talking about two of the most obese countries in the world, where the diabetes reaches a limit that hasn't been reached before, where the use of antidepressive is skyrocketing. And I argued with them, and I said, how could you come to face this crowd and pretend that these are the happiest countries in the world? And I questioned those, how do you reach those? I ran a company here that does, we deal with companies, and it's always a challenge, because we're talking about, at the end of the day, these are intangibles. There is no way for you to go to a company and say, we're gonna, by doing this, you're gonna change your results by this and this amount %. And that's for people like me, that's an everyday fight. That's an everyday battle. Now, I figure you have faced few of these leaders from companies around the world. So what do you say to them? How do you come with a tangible number where you can tell them, no, not doing this is more expensive than doing it?
Go ahead.
Well, it's a wonderful question, and you illustrate the complexity of this. The measures that we have, as I alluded to earlier, are not very good, and I agree with you that how can we call a country that has skyrocketing rates of diabetes, obesity, and has all the other kinds of problems that both Mexico and the United States have, how can we call them countries that are in the top 20 or 25 countries in the world in a happiness index? And this simply reflects the impoverished quality of these measures. We can measure this much more precisely. One of the initiatives in the center that I direct is to develop mobile measures that we can deploy at scale that we think will do a much better job than the measures that we have today. If we can't measure it, then no CEO is going to be interested in this. And one of the things that we found is we've talked to CEOs of major global companies is that they want hard-nosed metrics. And we think that we can get to that point. We don't think we're there yet, but we can measure attention. We can measure these basic qualities of well-being in hard-nosed, objective ways, and we think that these measures will then predict measures like absenteeism, healthcare costs, productivity, that companies themselves are already measuring. So we think we can get measures that are immediate, that will relate to these longer-term outcomes that the business community really cares about. But we're still at an early stage in this work. I think in 5 years we'll be at a very different place.
Do you believe in gross national happiness?
I do, but I think that the way gross national happiness has been measured is impoverished, and we need to develop better measures of this. You know, Bill Gates just started an initiative in Alzheimer's disease, and 100% of the funds for this initiative are not going to treating Alzheimer's or to develop a new cure for Alzheimer's. What they're going to is a better measure of Alzheimer's. We don't have good measures. And this is what we need in the domain of well-being. We need really hardcore measures. We don't have them yet. But in 5 years, I think we'll be at a very different place. And we think that it will be possible to measure this in much different and much more objective ways than we're measuring it today. So I think that gross national happiness is a useful concept, but it's going to be much more useful if it is based on better measures.
So in winding up here our talk, Peggy, if you could just share some ideas with respect to where we go from here, and what you'd be on the lookout for.
Well, I didn't fully respond to your question earlier about the role of philanthropy in all of this. And first of all, I just want to be clear that when I talk about philanthropy, I'm talking about the original meaning of philanthropy, which is love of humanity. So it's not just a question of giving money. It's a question of giving of ourselves in whatever way we can, whether it includes money or even not, whether it has to do with that service with love, which is extremely fulfilling for the server, possibly even more than for the served. So we ought to think of our own self-interest in that. And I guess I would say that what I mentioned earlier, finding ways to bring together diverse members of your own community and engage in dialogue, engage in trust building, engage in civic involvement, but not civic against the government or civic against businesses, but civic in the sense of we are all part of Mexican society. We all need to work together, whether it's on education or against violence or against corruption or whatever it is, so that within ourselves, within each of ourselves, we have to take some responsibility for this. How can I overcome the obstacles that are holding me back from having the courage to be out there, to be vulnerable, to be caring, and to serve with love?
Richie, how do you want to serve with love?
Well, I love the unabashed use of love, and so I want to
Philia, actually.
To thank Peggy. More people in civic society, in the business world, and in science need to use that word and have a sense of what it actually conveys. I do think that there's a lot of reason for optimism despite all of the difficulties that we face. And the reasons for optimism are fundamentally because human beings have the capacity to transform themselves. We're the only species that really has this capacity to this extent, far greater than any other species. And so the very mechanisms in our mind that have gotten us into trouble will be the mechanisms that will enable us to overcome the challenges that we face. And if we really all take this to heart and understand that every human being shares the same wish to be happy and to be free of suffering, and to treat each person with respect, trust, and love in this way, the world would really be a different place. And I think we can all do it. And I also know that Atentamente is playing a central role in this country. And I hope that all of you here can help to support and honor the work that they're doing, because it will make a difference for this country.
Thank you very much, Richie. Thank you very much, Peggy. Daniela, you wanted to mention something?
Yes.
Go ahead. Llévale la...
I just want to say that we didn't pay for them to talk about Atentamente. But I want to say, y lo quiero decir en español, pero para que lo entiendan ellos también, que todo el trabajo que pudimos hacer nosotros lo hacemos en hombros de gigantes en la Secretaría de Educación Pública, que tuvieron una visión de cómo transformar al país y cómo integrar las habilidades socioemocionales, ¿no?, para los maestros, para los niños. Lo hacemos de la mano de muchos expertos. Están aquí nuestros compañeros de la Universidad Iberoamericana, de Naciones Unidas, están también aquí gente de la UNAM. Entonces nada más quería decir que les juro, no les pagamos, ni se los pedimos, ni se los pagamos, y que realmente es honor a quien un honor merece, y quiero agradecer. Y creo que entre otras también Fundación Banorte, que nos ha apoyado, gente que tiene una visión para este país, ¿no? Para que realmente estas cualidades puedan ser parte de lo que educamos, que sea una labor de todos, ¿no? Entonces sí lo quería decir porque pareciera que fuéramos qué o qué, y no, esto no se hace nunca solos, ¿no? Y quiero agradecerles a toda la gente aquí de la Secretaría, donde están las del Ibero, acá ya, I just want to say that we didn't do it alone, and that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and the people in the ministry who have the vision and are experts on society and universities that have helped us and supported us and made this possible. So I really wanted to say that. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Richie. Thank you very much, Peggy. I leave you with that thought. O sea, los dejo con este pensamiento, el hecho de que finalmente estamos aquí en México y no en otro lugar. Este ha sido un esfuerzo por parte de un grupo muy importante de mexicanos, también con mucha ayuda internacional, validación internacional por medio de las mejores instituciones de investigación en ese sentido. Sin embargo, no regresamos a este punto que acaba de hacer Daniela. Este es un programa de mexicanos para mexicanos, con la sociedad civil, con las autoridades, con fundaciones como Fundación Banorte, y en ese sentido yo creo que todos como mexicanos podemos estar muy orgullosos de todo lo que hemos hecho como sociedad. Busquemos el llevarlo al próximo nivel como debería de ser, y pues bueno, con esta ayuda, cómo no hacerlo. Muchísimas gracias.